speaker today, who is Pidge. Pidge is an artist and educator who's a creator, illustrator, and letterer of the Ignatz Award-nominated comic Infinite Wheat Paste, which she will have for sale at her table Saturday and Sunday. She currently resides in a quiet mountain town in the heart of the Colorado Rockies with her spouse and colorist, Professor Charles Hutchison, who I just saw in the hallway. He's around there. Okay, sorry. When she isn't drawing or teaching middle schoolers, she could be found knitting and snowboarding, but you could find her right here in 3 seconds.
Make sure this works. There we go, perfect. Thank you. Hi, so I'm Pidge, and I make a comic called Infinite Wheat Paste, and I am really excited to be here. I think my first time at CXC was in 2016 or 2017, and I couldn't get into the show, and I came anyway, and I'm so glad I did. It is absolutely the gem of comics, this place and this event. And I'm really excited just to be a part of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about breaking the frame of comics and ways that different artists do that. And we're also going to talk about closure. And in that closure, I think there's a little bit of magic. So we are going to talk a little bit about magic, but more in the intent and manifestation. And so these are some pages from my comic. Let me see if you guys have, oh nice, you do have a laser pointer. Just to acknowledge some differences about how I'm used to speaking. I'm really like working against habit. This feels more like a marathon to me, whereas I'm more of an Usain Bolt. When you have middle schoolers, you have a finite amount of attention. My bathroom passes are in the back. Please hold all pencil sharpening until after we have gone through questions. And I rush through to get, hopefully, to their project. So I do feel like I'm going against muscle memory quite a bit. My background is in sculpture and art history. And so I went from doing 45-minute lectures at a time, which would fit this, to going to that smaller format and working with 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th graders who have varying amounts of attention span. So it's been kind of fun to get to work back and get to think a little bit more about comics this way. It's also really nice to get to talk to an initiated audience. So thank you guys for your time, and thank you for being at CXC. If you have not taken the tour, please do. It is absolutely life-changing. So when I first came to CXC, I was actually still working in a place where I needed to wear a uniform. And I was working in a hotel, and the space between all of the panels, if we think about breaking the frame, but for me, I think my daily life was the frame. It was the panel. We have all these restrictions. Panels are kind of like rules, and it's nice when you can break those rules. And for me, breaking the frame was imagining all these places that I could go, which became Infinite Wheat Paste. So I wasn't just checking hotel doors in the cold night. I was imagining spaceships in the deepest, coldest outer space. I think, unfortunately, my brain has a tendency to wander. And teaching as a middle school teacher, you have to be really focused on what your present is. And I think, again, my frame often breaks as I go into these other places. And so when it came to explaining my life, I found the parts that were most true and most potent were the ones breaking the frame, which is kind of where this talk started. I was really interested in what that phenomenon was in not just closure, I think, between the audience, like, the reader and the comic, but I think there's also a closure between the artist and that comic. And I felt very much that I was experiencing that closure. A little bit about how I came into comics just as a human being. My brother is significantly older than me, and I spent a lot of time following him around and needing to do whatever he did, including wearing the same, not at this moment, but wearing the same shoes that he would wear at different periods to this day. And really wishing I could touch his comics and not being allowed. And I don't know if that makes it more enticing, but there are magical places where you get to touch all the comics, and in between the frame, breaking the frame here for me, representing that place, that magic where you're reading the comic and you're no longer connected to yourself, but you're just connected to this moment happening in your hands. I think that's closure too. It's not just between the gutters, it's not just between the panels. I think that closure is a relationship. And I think artists who really love comics know how to reach out in that relationship because they experienced that love. So just in my comic itself, I think I chose an example where I more conventionally break the frame, just so we could see, and I'm getting into some other artists down the line here who are amazing, and I'm not making comparisons, but just I wanted to show you some conventional ways that the frame gets broken. So this is part of issue 2 and 3. I believe this is in issue 3 actually. And it's a time travel story. And of course, in a time travel story, you have the linear narrative is more of a cause and effect thing. So when you're breaking that space, you're doing something you can't do in film. Film is limited by its frame and then time. Comics, you really get this experience of space. And cartoonists who just treat comics, this is my soapbox, but just treat comics as a place to put a screenplay or a place to just put that story, they're really missing out on what's beautiful about comics, and that you have all this room to play and you shouldn't feel restricted to your panel. So we have moving through moments in time here where they're all sort of happening simultaneously, and we have a great thing in comics where we can read them. I think the writing you need to read almost always in a linear fashion, right? We read left to right, top down. And the nice thing about some of the examples I'm going to be showing you later, you can really read the images very non-linearly, which is, I think, closer to how we process things, right? We don't see one moment, we see many moments at the same time. We see all these conversations over the years that we've had with one person who's standing in front of us, all sort of channeling through what we're living right now. You can break up space to show a feeling. And a savvy reader can tell that you are playing more with a feeling than you are with something that actually happened. I think if this girl had suddenly become a giantess, people would be reacting to it. So a savvy reader knows that she just feels disembodied. She feels in her own way. She feels like she's stuck on her own feet. And I just put the whole sequence. So in this story, it was really a story to deal, and I read some interesting academic writing about closure, and that between the panels is a place where you could put trauma, but it's also a place where you can repair that trauma. And I found that as like an interesting track that I hadn't really thought of consciously. And so going back through other works, and especially this one, I was really struck by that. In this comic, she's mending harm that has been caused to her through time and reaching outside of those panels and reaching through the gutters to repair that harm. And I felt a little singled out by that academic writing. So there she is falling through the ice, being disappointed by someone. Here she is going through time, seeing herself falling through the ice. And she's already saved herself. Here she is experiencing other forms of harm. She alludes to sort of it's also like her relationship to water, but it's also her relationship to her grandmother and kind of that cold harm in that relationship. And there she is, saving herself and not being rescued. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just save ourselves and protect ourselves in that way? But that's why she's a goddess and we're not. So, just some other things I might have pulled these for something else, but there you go, that's fun. I also like the idea of breaking the frame to show consciousness and show thought. So this is actually from my Ignatz nominated issue, but it's just an issue I really love. And I saw it was doing a similar thing. So when Otis is thinking, he has all these sort of encoded things, and I like that that's secret from the viewer. I think there's something really sympathetic. You can almost feel what he's thinking, and his thoughts actually change throughout the comic, pre and post Enlightenment, and representing what an enlightened person, like how they might process. And so we have a nice way to spatially break up a narrative and use one central place. And I think this one's a little easier to read. We're going to get into some more complex ones. All these moments happening together. I got a chance to talk to, it's so nice when you get a chance to talk to a young artist and somebody just starting out and figuring out what they like and getting to look at their work and say, I think you liked this page better and tell me why. And them being afraid to break their panels, but they did on one. And that was such an exciting experience for me to shift to mentoring this person. You liked that page better and it shows. And why can't you do that more? And it was the page that was actually most frightening or like maybe scary for them to make. And I think it's because when we break those panels, we're giving ourselves a place to be a little bit more honest with that audience. I think it's a place where this is my representation of me, clearly a dead ringer. It's kind of that, I don't think glasses would have done my Clark Kent thing I need to do at school. Not all of my comics are appropriate for children, so it's very on the DL. And so that's also why there are not many pictures of me on the internet. But there's also part of that, there's a representation of me. But it's also a nice place to talk directly to the audience. And I think this magic, I talk about knitting as magic and knitting as a place where you can put that intent. And the place between those panels really is magic. It's the place where your mind works with the creator to make some kind of manifestation. And what happens between the panels? I like to think that between the panels is where life happens. It's where the reader happens. It's where the artist maybe doesn't show everything. And I think that oblique kind of storytelling is really, it really speaks to where I'm from. I'm from a small farm community in Illinois. And I think it takes about 20 to 30 years to piece together a story that people don't want to tell. So they're always telling around the story. Consequently, I tend to talk around my point, and then maybe I'm trying to get better at directly telling my point. But all that life makes all that magic happen. It's where an artist might replenish themselves and find the next beat of their story. No, my clicker went out. Hold on. Okay. I thought I was gonna paste more. Oh, you know what? I was wondering why we didn't get to the other stuff. So that one, that's CXC panel. And that's why those other images were in there. I didn't expect them. I need CXC. Hey Chase, have you got the jump drive? I got some, we can move on to someone more interesting. I got some Chris Ware and some Allison Bedell for you guys. And that's why that was taking a minute. So sorry about that. That was supposed to scroll on my panel, but you should go on Saturday, I think. Is it Saturday, Sunday? I don't know. I'll be there. How about that? There we go. And if I can get it to preview.
Control down.
Okay, now I like this because now I know I need to speed up, and that's more like the middle school mode. So I like that. I like that pacing better. So, yep, there's me clearly in my natural habitat. There's some great comics that deal with this idea of closure, and there's some famous examples, but I really wanted to look at some that were more independent comics. But I think a lot of us might remember this one, so I thought this is worth putting in here. If you haven't read this, it is a lovely comic called Of All Things. It's Animal Man from DC, but Grant Morrison does some really interesting things with it. I like that the panel hasn't been broken here yet. Like there's still like some play there at, is this happening in the story or is this talking directly to you? And how neat does that feel? If any of you have turned that page, you remember it. Because you were a part of that moment. I think that's what's actually very magical about that idea of closure. And that's why I didn't see? Didn't realize I was on the wrong presentation. But then why were those other ones in there? See? So that closure, it wasn't working. So, there you go. I think each panel and each stitch are sort of a magical place where you, and this gets into my knitting theories, but they're valid. Where you get into a place where your wishes, hopes, worries, dreams, and a whole universe that is inside you can be. And I think what I like about doing knitting is I can put all that in there and I didn't show it to you. And in a comic, it's so much more vulnerable to show that magic happening. And now we'll get into the more academic stuff. This comic came out when I was working on my undergraduate thesis, and none of the stuff I'm talking about here was in that thesis, but it completely turned my thesis upside down and was kind of one of those magical moments in comics where you just get to respond to something happening. And this is Alison Bedell's Are You My Mother? And there's so many interesting things happening with frames within frames with these mirrors. And if you haven't read it, it is really dense, really interesting, and has a sense to me of all these barriers and vulnerability. Like she puts her guts out there, and then she puts all these layers and mirrors and frames in between. And I think she leaves space in between those words and that closure to let you find that meaning. And it feels like a very participatory comic in that sense. Every single bit of text, if you get a chance, I wrote down the name, I believe it's Hillary Shute, did a fantastic interview with Alison Bedell that I highly recommend you go and watch or read. And Alison Bedell really gets into some things that I was wondering 10 years ago, which would have been more helpful then to me. But that every single bit of text, except for very conspicuously one part, was hand done by her. So in Dykes to Watch Out For, she hand lettered it. But this is the first comic. She doesn't hand letter the captions or the fumetti. And she says it was for strictly like, sort of a utilitarian thing. She just didn't want to do that. It was more of a workload kind of thing. But then she takes really great pains, there's some more frames, to do redos of other people's text. And in a short list, she redoes the writing and the typesetting on excerpts from Melanie Klein, Wincott, Lacan, Freud, to Jung, to Alice Miller, but not her own. She made a font of herself. And if that isn't putting up some kind of place to hide, I'm not sure what is, but she can call me out on that if she wants. And I love in this comic, when I thought about somebody who deals with closure really differently, this was the one I really thought about. She breaks her panels, and I think text is such an abstract system, and even back to magic, our understanding of early text, people who didn't know yet how to read and make that magic in their brains, but interacted with writing systems, started attributing magic to those writing systems. And even people who could read would sort of realign those texts, turn them into sigils, and sort of move text around to reinterpret it and make it a more abstract interpretation. And the way that she breaks up this text, resizing, moving, breaking the panel, to me really says a little bit of that magic of closure. She's leaving those meanings to you. It's a word, but I really notice the spaces in between, and that she's making you connect what those mean. And really working with an audience she knows is savvy. Again, put in a font of her own writing, but then takes great pains. In some of these, she talked about tracking down certain nibs just to use the same kind of writing as someone else, but then not doing her own lettering style, which is fascinating. But between all of these, she lets you pull out that meaning. Also, I like that this book functions very much as an artifact. And in this book, there's Winnicott, who's a very central figure, if you haven't read this. Winnicott, his work dealt a lot with children and their transitional objects. Checking my time. Their transitional objects, and how Winnicott himself, when doing his research, kept a journal, and when he got really close to the meaning and the summation of that research on children and how they create their self, he discarded that object. It was a transition. And I think what's really interesting to me is she made an entire comic. She kept a journal during this practice, but then she made this transitional object. Just like a child might have a bear for a while, a child might understand themselves through their mother first and then carry around their bear with them who they check on, and then suddenly the bear goes away. It becomes something else, and I get this sense that she doesn't need it anymore. How big that one word is and how much meaning is in between. And when we make comics, we spend a lot of time thinking about how the images do something different. And I love the way Allison really subverts that expectation and makes the text do something that we didn't expect it to do in a comic. She also re-letters the words of her mother and her father, including their typed words, but not her own. Now, there's your transitional object, child with their teddy bear. All these artifacts are painstakingly reconstructed, so she doesn't scan in anything, including her own childhood writing, which she does redraw. She also recreates family photos. I'm not going to talk about building stories because everybody talks about building stories. But what a beautiful object. And it does get to, we're moving on. It does get to, I think, if any of you got to watch, it was amazing, Caitlin McGurk interview Chris Ware a few years ago. He talked about grid cells, and I immediately went back to the hotel and wanted to know everything. So I think just understanding grid cells are a part of your brain that help you spatially navigate. And if we think about how Chris Ware uses space, so this is going to be a completely different way of interacting with the audience with closure. Chris Ware has these comics that really expand what is even the end of this comic. Where does it stop? Does it stop with the box? Does it stop with the game board? Does it stop with the 3D pieces? Is that a comic? He has these really beautiful non-linear spatial, again, back to his space, and how we actually construct with our grid cells miniature maps of places in our minds. He makes places that we want to navigate. And I wonder if he's trying to make us build our own maps in our minds. Sneaky devil. Is that a comic? Is that a comic? If you thought yes, I want you to think about what steps happened in your mind? What kind of closure and magic did you experience that said, yes, this is a comic? Was it because it was in the comic? Relates to? And I want to talk about specifically Acme Novelty Library, Volume 20. For some reason, I always get the number wrong, so I had to put it at the top. I don't know why I always want to call it number 19, but I do. And that is lint. One of my favorite things, and as soon as it came out, became one of those things that I started amassing way too many of and giving to people who didn't even read comics. Just, you need to read this. So what a beautiful piece. As somebody who works around children and has worked with children, I couldn't hack that pre-K world. It was a lot. I've done it. Children who are just starting to form who they are, all the way up to high school. And my current life realm is that middle school space, which is so fun. It's all about who am I? High school, I think they feel brave enough to try on more who am I's. But that formation of who we are, as somebody who's worked with children at all of these ages, I really, really loved this comic even more after that. How do we move an image to a symbol or an idea? How do we relate to our own selves? And I love that in the closure of this comic, Chris Ware builds a person, their entire perception, and they dissolve. And what a power comics has to do that. I don't think anywhere else quite has that power. The ability to shift those styles. If we think about this age as a person, I know these aren't in between the panels, but I think those meanings are really between those images. We're building these ideas. How many of you remember the first word you ever knew how to spell? No? Oh, well, I was very annoying with cat. Until my mother was like, no more cat, please. I was so excited I knew how to spell cat. And I love that it comes with these fully spelled things. And we have these numbers that are associated with colors that were probably in a classroom that had the number 4 table in yellow and the number 5 table in blue. And I can see all that happening, and I don't know if he tricked me or if that's just me. That's what I like about it. I think later on, when they start to spell it, he starts to spell those numbers. That's a big step. Just kind of more who I deal with. I am. I think I see people right in the middle of their I ams. And I love in between these panels how much space there is for that to come off. In that I am, he doesn't really need to give you much more, does he? He really gave it to you all in one place. And you know how important that step in life is when we figure out who we are. I might be. Have an image forming in your head, not quite solid. Kind of goes back to forming another image of a person. Look at all the closure between those dots he gave you to do that. Use this. Spare a thought for me. Yes, I am so sick of everything. maybe I'm just gravitated. I don't do this often in my comics, but I really am gravitated to that text, what's in between that text. Seeing stars. I like that he represents that place between the panels where we're not sure what's happening, the character's not sure what's happening. It's a very vulnerable place between those panels. And it harkens back to those things that maybe we don't remember so well. I haven't experienced this religion before, but I think I understand it better after reading this. I have grown up around practitioners of the religion of football, but I've yet to ascribe to a subsect. I love that the colors match as well. Need that Nebraska red in there. All those things happening between the panels. It's really subtle, but I love that God isn't contained quite by the panel. Just like, maybe you left a little room for Jesus. No, just... Why is it when we get older, and I think about that artist I spoke to a few weeks ago, why is it when we get older we think we're supposed to put things in these panels? And we're supposed to stay in those lines and those constrictions? And when you're making your own comic, how many cartoonists have I got in here? If I could see? Do you feel like, I wonder where we hold back. Do we feel like we can't be vulnerable sometimes? Are we stuck with what is a comic supposed to look like? And maybe that's a developmental stage. He's in a lot of supposed tos. Memories really disrupt our supposed tos. Feelings really do too. When you burn your hand on a stove, that there's a little nodule that forms at the end of a receptor of some tiny thing, I'm getting it wrong, in your brain, and it tells you don't do that again because it hurt. And it just overrides everything else you were thinking about. And you're about to step off that curb, or you're about to do something that relates to something that hurt you once, and you really break that panel and go, oh, don't do that again. God doesn't need a panel. Feelings break the panel. And this, I'm glad we can do this together. I don't know about you, if you haven't read it, the first time I read this, and it's about not a nice person, but he was bawling. He was a flawed person, and I like that it's very sympathetic. At least you understood that person. We fade in and we fade out. All our life might happen in those panels, but I would argue that some of the most beautiful things happen in between and before and after. Does everything beautifully, doesn't he? It's nice to end with him. So I don't know if anybody had any thoughts or questions. If anybody needed to use the restroom or sharpen their pencil, you can do it now. We have about 5 minutes, and I didn't pace around the room. Normally I have to do this and go all through and go like, get out of your phone. I didn't take anybody's devices. This is really hard for me. Oh. Yes.
I have a question. So I tend to think kind of like inside the box, and that's how my work works. Do you have any tips for like thinking more abstractly in terms of like page shapes or anything like that, so that it's not just defaulting to the 6-panel grid?
Yeah, I think for me, if we go, I won't flip all the way through there, but I will either start with a flow, so I'll give myself a directional line if I want to use the whole page, and then build around a directional line, because I want to think about how the reader enters a page and how they exit the page. Or I will give myself a central image that just keeps coming back to me. I read some great stuff about how Between the Gutters is really where we can put our unconscious and our subconscious. And Freud actually included an 8-panel comic in, I wrote it down. Oof, there we go. The Interpretation of Dream. And Freud talked about how we have all these patterns that in comics that we can unconsciously let happen there. And so when I think about whatever my central image ends up being, you're asking about like, how do you break that panel? For me, I like to start there, and then I start to see these patterns emerge, and I feel like I pulled a trick on myself, and I start working back from there. Why does this image keep coming up? And comics unfortunately have lost some respect in the mid 20th century. Thank you, 10-cent plague. But it was considered one of the 8 lively arts. And so there are these people like Freud who took comics seriously back in the day before the 10-cent plague and cared about these things, or at least respected these things, and would talk about comics. So that's a really interesting one to check out too. Yes?
We talked in previous lectures how like undergrad students are getting more and more excited about comics. Are you seeing that reflected in the grades that you teach?
So do I see, I'm supposed to rephrase the question in my answer. So do I see just like how grad students are getting really excited about comics? Do I see that in my younger students? Absolutely.
Cool.
And when they find out I like comics, it's like they found their person, and I love getting to be that person. It's like a calling in life. So they're excited. They get so much more access. I'm in a tiny little mountain town, and it's a dinky little library, and we have so many more comics than those of us in the audience or up here would remember having. And they get to see not just that, but like awesome queer representation in comics. And I'm so excited for who these people are going to grow up to be, and maybe be my peers. So, anybody else? Yes.
You showed a bunch of really cool examples. Are there any more works that you feel like have elements of like the subjects you're talking about being really heavy and metaphysical that you weren't able to fit into your presentation?
So are there any examples of comics that got into this kind of metaphysical realm and broke the panel that didn't get in? I would say Building Stories did it in a very elegant way. I just didn't want to redo. And there are so many wonderful things written about it, and you shouldn't read any of them until you read the comic first. So, and there are lots of others. Yeah. Okay. So thank you all. You can sharpen your pencils, use the restroom, get